Nice. Now you say modeling, so showing, showing, not telling. Great. Practicing with me. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Close feedback, repetition. I see that, Tara. Yes. Exact specific feedback. Great. Giving opportunities for additional practice, right? Anytime we're learning a new skill, we're not expected to learn it that first time, right? Got to get that repetition in. Great. The face-to-face feedback, I'm seeing that in the one-to-one feedback, goal setting together. Yes. Yes, this definitely reminds me of that first principal I had, that she, would try to come in once a week, and then we would be able to debrief, and she'd give those small things. We will work on that goal together. Great. Showing me what to do better and then talking through it. Great. Excellent. So it's no surprise that we want to kind of frame our work here as we can be coaches and supports to those in our schools, so students and teachers. And then we want teachers, obviously, to think of themselves as coaches for their students, right? Like, we want to be those supportive people in students' lives. So let's keep that sort of coach hat in mind as we're going through today. I want to remind you that last time we met, we talked about that diagnosing and uncovering the unfinished learning in math. So these were sort of the key points that we talked about. Before we jump into the work today, let's just reframe that. Let me give you a minute to reread those. And the big idea last time was that, first, we as educators want to understand the math we teach. We want to understand those progressions so that we understand how it fits together for students. And then we want to uncover what students know or don't know just yet. So we want to be looking at bite-sized pieces of information for just-in-time acceleration instruction. So we talked a lot about that last time. So I'd love to hear if you can personally reflect first, and then if you're willing to unmic or unmute or chat, were you able, if you were able, to collaborate with your team on some of this? So either working on understanding progressions together or looking at some student work from one of those brief just-in-time diagnostic assessments. If you're able to do that, what went well, what was maybe challenging, what was something you learned, and what might you do the same or differently next time? So I'll give you a minute to think there. And then whenever you're ready to share, you can drop it in the chat or unmute. I know last time it was towards the end of our session where folks were sharing more about what was going on in their schools, but I think we'd all love to hear how things are going whenever you're ready.
Hi, this is Jennifer at Wakanda. We, since we met last time, we've had spring break and haven't had a chance to meet in our grading windows. We haven't been able to meet with our PLCs since we got all of this kind of new learning, but we are meeting tomorrow actually. And so we'll be looking at our teachers will be looking at how students did in chapter 7 on their assessments, and then looking forward at chapter 8. and what is coming up on that assessment. So I think we'll be able to kind of look at, well, for fourth grade, looking at those third grade, what the standard says, and then backwards mapping for that third grade standard and what maybe some missed learning was and how we plan for that just in time instruction. So we're excited to try some of the things that we've learned, and we've shared with teachers that we've learned some things that we're excited to share with them. So we'll be able to share next time what how things went or what we might need some help with.
That sounds great. Well, it's great that you all have a plan to be putting that in action, to be doing that backwards mapping and thinking, great.
Yeah.
And hopefully you had a restful spring break. Did everybody have spring
Yeah.
break between then and now?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Oh,
well,
nice.
I don't know if non-OPS schools did, but OPS schools did. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's great. Okay. The spring breaks around here are kind of just starting. So yeah. Oh, that's great. I'm sure you guys really appreciated that break. Well, thanks for sharing. Yeah. And if anybody wants to share like a plan you're thinking about based on the last session, feel free to share that too.
Well, right now we've been looking at more of the reading unfinished and creating groups because we were able to hire an interventionist. So I'm sorry I can't speak to what we're doing in math, but we've been doing this in reading, more specifically looking at where students are, thinking about what they've missed, thinking about how we can close that achievement gap, being able to find an interventionist who is a retired teacher. It just happened to work out perfectly. So we're looking at that in the reading frame, but not necessarily the math right now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing. I'm glad you're able to hire that support for students. That's great. Okay. Anyone else want to share before we move into today's session? It is okay. All right. Let's keep moving here then. So while we focused before on norming around what we mean by accelerate learning for students and then talking about how we can uncover that unfinished learning, now today we're going to really dig in and look at some examples of how we can take action on this information. So what can we do and how can we plan those supports to support students? So that's us. We're going to be looking at that, planning and taking action. So we spent the first 10 minutes here getting started. We're going to take 45 minutes to look at what this could look like, planning the acceleration supports. And then we have about 30 minutes to read some examples of how that was delivered. And you'll notice that the planning is a little longer than the delivery, which we notice sometimes happens, right? We need to put some time into that planning so we can make the most of our time. But I do want to get you some examples of what it could look like to plan, to deliver, and then monitor how students are doing. Then, of course, the last 5 minutes wrapping up. Before we dig in today, and I think I've said this before, I just want to reiterate it. You're going to see these vignettes, and I think that sometimes when we look at these vignettes and we look at the templates, it's easy to focus on the templates or think like, oh, whoa, this is a lot. Some students might, or some teachers or faculty might be overwhelmed by this. But I want to just encourage you that it's not the templates. You probably know this, but I just want to say it again, that it's not the templates so much as the process. So, we put the templates in so you could see how it would be organized, but you don't have to use these templates, right? It might just be your, you may have an acceleration notebook and you're keeping those notes there. But the idea is that what's in those templates is what the teacher's thinking about and the administration is thinking about. So it's really about that process rather than the templates. So I just want to say that ahead of time. Okay, so last time we're going to pick up where we left off. You probably remember Miss Hutchins was a grade 4 teacher at Brightwood Academy, and she just analyzed her students' work based on that Eureka acceleration tool. So remember, those are those brief just-in-time assessments that we can use to see student understanding of those prerequisite skills. So she gave this assessment about comparing fractions, and then she was able to see how students did. And she noticed that 11 students seemed ready to access the 4th grade material, but there were those 9 students who probably she thought based on their evidence would benefit from small group. Okay, so let's reframe where we were. Some of those students, I think there were about 5 of them, really seemed like they needed pretty intensive intervention or acceleration to get there. And then there were some that seemed like they need just a little more. So these were some of the topics that we were looking for when we left off in that 3-question assessment. So let me let you reorient yourself with what she noticed and what she was looking for from her students. Okay. All right. So we're back where we were. She knew that she wanted to, increase student understanding in these areas. So now what does she do? As many of us have done, myself included, she could have taken to some of these, resources, Google, Pinterest, Teachers Pay Teachers, these sites that are available online. But, what might be the problem with that? You know, there's we know from surveys that these are often what teachers go to. The problem is that, math is progressive, right? And so we need to see that progression and we need to be using our instructional materials. So, as much as possible, we want to encourage using instructional materials rather than, activities like worksheets. And not to mention, it takes time for teachers to find those versus going to an already vetted resource, that high quality material. We also talked about 2 sessions ago the TNTP study, the opportunity myth, and the importance of putting high quality grade level material in front of students. And it's really an equity issue. So, as we're talking about all these things today, one of the big takeaways is that, especially for students who need acceleration work, we want to be putting high quality material in front of them. We're going to look at some examples of those today. So as you might remember, this is one of those pillars of when we're doing acceleration work. We want to have those high quality materials in front of students. Okay, so to that end, we're going to look at a resource in just a moment, and this is called the Accelerate Math resources. So you might be familiar with these. If you're less familiar, we're going to look at them today. Right now, they have them for grades K through 5, and I'm told that pre-K and high school are coming soon if those are things you're interested in. And we'll go there in just a second. And you'll see on the page that there's something called the Accelerate Math PDF on the left, and then it will open a page that looks like on the right, and you can click on your grade level. So let me give you a moment. There's a link in your note catcher. It's kind of that second box down. If you just want to click on that for 1 minute and just explore what that looks like, and then we'll come back and talk about what we can use these for, and we'll look at an actual example. So 1 minute to click in onto that page just to explore. And anyone who entered, I don't want to say late, but later than the folks that were a little early, the note catcher is in the chat if you need it. Okay, maybe like 20 more seconds to look at that site, and then we'll dig in further. If you are interested, just FYI, on that Accelerate site, there are some webinars that they put on. So if you're interested in watching those, I know that those are available. So those are on, like, this guidance is on the left side of the page and the webinars are on the right. So if you want to bookmark that, feel free to do so. But let's dig in a little more to these resources. So the resources that we're about to explore, I want to tell you what they're for and what they're not for. So they are, if you read the thing at the top, you probably got the gist that they are to support the most essential prerequisite knowledge and skills. So these are those foundational understandings that we want students to have. It is for designated time outside of the math instructional block. I know this is sort of a sometimes a scary thing to say if you don't have that time, but you may have longer math blocks where your teachers do small groups. So this could be an example of something they're working on in small group. They are designed for 1 hour of virtual instruction for 2 sessions per week. So you'll see each sort of, it's like a Google Slides. You'll see that that's what it's designed for. And the intention was that you work on it in small groups, and instruction of students with common needs. So you look at that diagnostic, these 3 students have this common not yet understanding, let's put them together. So, and the idea of the small groups will probably come as no surprise to you all, is that we want to get students talking about math, right? Like, do the math, talk about the math. That's how they're going to make the meaning. And so the hope is that we can work with them in these small groups. It's not necessarily intended for intensive intervention. So like if students have a specialized plan, that plan should be followed. It's also not intended for whole group mini lessons before every topic. We would not get to grade level material if we were doing this before every lesson, every topic. So just to kind of frame us there, that this is really for small group work with students to accelerate them along. Okay, so if you clicked on that page, I want to just give you an example of what it looks like once you click into, say, like 4th grade. So on the very left side, you'll see the grade level and the module that's listed. And this matches the Eureka Math or Engage New York if you're using that. If you're not, that's okay. You could look at this this next section, the session focus topic, because while these are mapped to those Eureka Engage New York resources, you can use them for any curriculum because the grade level standards are tagged here. So for example, in the second column, place fractions on a number line to compare. That's what, when you click on this link, you'll see those activities for students. The connected grade level standards are listed, and then they also list the source content. So like if you see something, for example, you're like, oh, I wish we had more of those practice for students, you could go to these prior lessons and find them. And then of course, they also tell you what resources you will need or are available. Some of them have links to virtual manipulatives or Desmos activities. So it just varies by the module, by the topic and grade level. Okay, so now let's actually take a look at one. So in your note catcher, there is a direct link to Module 5, Lessons 12 to 15, which is what would map to the diagnostic that we gave last time. So you can click on that link, or you can go to the site you were on before and click on grade 4 and scroll down to Module 5, Lessons 12 through 15. So if you're on this page, you can do that. And then once you're in that, you can scroll down here to the Module 5, Lessons 12 to 15. Or as I mentioned, the direct link is also in your note catcher. And then could I just get either a live thumbs up or a thumbs up on Zoom if you are there and you have the Google Doc or Google Slides open that we're looking at. All right, thanks Tara, thanks Ryan, thanks James. Thanks Maggie and Megan. Okay, great, awesome. Okay, so now we're actually gonna get a chance to look at these and we'll say 5 minutes for independent review. When I try to look at one of these in 5 minutes, I know it's not nearly enough time, but the idea is that you're trying to get a sense of what's included and what type of math and what type of questions we're asking students in these type of acceleration sessions. So we're gonna do 5 minutes of independent review of that document and then 2 minutes of share out. As you're looking at it, just jot down what you notice and wonder. Okay, I love notice and wonder in the math classroom and with adults. And then also think about, how does this content support the teacher, Ms. Hutchins, with addressing the unfinished learning? So we knew what students needed some more support with. How do these resources specifically help her with addressing that? Any questions before the 5 minutes of independent review time? All right, we'll see you in 5 minutes. All right, we'll come back together in just under a minute. All right, let's come back together. And let's just go ahead and go off mute and share. What did you notice? What do you wonder?
I noticed lots and lots of actual representation of the pieces and parts. And then there were comparisons of those. And because that children in this model in the lesson had to actually draw them out to the same size, kids were able to see, which is so important because sometimes even as teachers, we just draw it quickly, but it may not be represented equally, and so kids get confused with that. So I thought that was very powerful. And then how they were comparing them based on a number line as well, because we don't always draw them out that way as far as models are concerned. So I thought the number line was strong. But I thought something that was interesting was how, and I guess I've just never seen it this way, is we always represent fractions as a 1/3 for 1/3. But I thought it was interesting how they were actually writing the word out, which I think is very powerful because kids, like if you write 3/3, kids look at that as a 3 whole and then thirds and they get it mixed up. And so I thought that those just some noticings.
Tara, thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, and that hits right on one of the misunderstandings that we noticed from last time, that a lot of students, Tara, you named this, that they see 3 as the number 3 versus this idea that 3/3 is 3 pieces of size 1/3. And so, yeah, and I would say that it was probably intentional by the writers of these resources, right? Because they know that that's a common misunderstanding. So they wrote that out to have students say, oh, 2/8, right? So thank you for pointing that out. Other things you noticed and wondered? Did anyone look at it on presenter mode so you could see the reveals? How you would like ask the students a question, then you can click and it sort of shows the shading. It's nice that that's made for you, right? I mean, that takes forever. You have to do it yourself as a teacher. I remember that. So it's nice that those are there. Other noticings and wonderings? You can chat it if you prefer.
I noticed a lot of opportunities to work with, and that was, I think, part of the unfinished learning was just with the same numerator, but the denominator was different, and they had a lot of opportunities to do some comparing and look at what that really means and looks like to decide what, and then write the number sentence that goes with that, even what is greater and what is less than. So I just noticed some of those pieces.
Great. Yes, exactly. They're really hitting that prior third grade standard that we were focused on, that students needed to compare fractions that have the same numerator. And so they're giving them experience with that. And then, yes, you're mentioning those number sentences, they actually have to use the greater than and less than symbol. So not only are they drawing, not only are they talking, they actually have to use those symbols. So making that transition. Nice noticing. Thank you.
I was just going to piggyback.
Uh-oh, we can't hear you now. Let's try it again.
There we go.
Oh, thank you.
I just kind of noticed with the visuals, and just kind of how key that is when teaching math. And that is something that we have been working for, that we saw as a need kind of last year. And this year, we kind of got started that with last year. And then this year kind of got away a little bit just because of everything. But it was something really focusing on. And then after our last meeting and going through Ms. Hutchinson, we kind of talked about that. And we brought it actually back to our 4th grade who's doing fractions at this time. And yeah, just again, just that visual piece of it and how it is difficult, like if they aren't the same. So it kind of, you have to be purposeful in how you're drawing that and taking some time with that and having it kind of pre-planned for your lesson for the day before, the day of. And then, yeah, so that was a thing that we took away from that. And also I saw on these tutoring slides as well, just the amount of visuals that they're using to really help students understand and have like a deeper understanding of those fractions and comparing them rather than just looking at the number itself.
Great, thanks. I think you said a lot of great things in there. They were thinking about this ahead of time, so they knew when they got into that lesson or they get into that tutoring session, I'm really focused on the same size whole. That was a big noticing that we had from that diagnostic. A lot of the class wasn't sure about that. So they were emphasizing that. And then, yeah, the visuals, I know it takes time. Students are developing their motor skills. We're developing ours still too. You mentioned sometimes we draw fast and it's not precise, but taking the time to do that helps them build that understanding. Great. And that actually goes into just really thinking about that those materials emphasize conceptual understanding. They're not a skill and drill worksheet, right? Because we want our students to actually understand. Many of you may be familiar with Van de Waal, education researcher in the area of mathematics. He had something called the Pentagon of conceptual understanding. And so we saw those alive in these materials. Students were drawing them to compare. Then they had to label the whole, explaining which is larger using words. They were actually partitioning the number lines in the models. So they were doing these things to build that conceptual understanding. So thanks for pointing that out. Yep, you guys named a lot of those. The one other thing I just want to note, I know it was only 5 minutes, so it's hard to notice all these nuances, but just point out that the first session that you looked at in that Google Slides, those were materials that were addressing a foundational third grade standard. So comparing the fractions with the same numerator. The second session was actually from a prior fourth grade lesson. So it had been earlier in that unit that maybe students needed some tightening up in their understanding. So it was building from the third grade and then now into that understanding that they might have been still working on from fourth grade just previously in the unit. So sometimes that happens. Sometimes it's all previous grade level material that's building toward current grade level material. Sometimes it's all previous grade level material that's building toward current. So it just depends on which topics you're covering. So great, thanks for sharing. Anyone else want to share anything they noticed or wondered? Okay, let's just quickly talk about how does this content that you look at, how would that support the teacher with addressing unfinished learning? What are some ways that supports the teacher to do this? I can start because I remember teaching right when the new standards came out and there was nothing, right? You spent hours trying to make things. So first of all, it's made, right? And it's high quality materials ready for the teacher to use with students. Other things?
Yeah, I agree with that because so many times we feel like we have to reinvent the wheel as teachers, when really and truly one of our best tools is being a polite thief of other people's ideas so that we can concentrate on the content and unpacking and understand the information ourselves so that we can really understand where kids were coming from, where were the prerequisite skills, and what are those skills that we're going to help move them forward. So I feel like this lesson, and then I didn't see the unpacking where it actually, or the piece where it actually drew it out for them. But I think so many times we spend time on the stuff versus the learning. So I think this would help with them.
Tara, such a great point. This teacher we're looking at as our example, this is her first time teaching fourth grade. She taught social studies before, but she hasn't taught fourth grade math. And so she might not be yet there in her own understanding of the progression. So having this there, it's ready, it meets the progressions is helpful in that way. Yep, and then he can spend his time on the actual instruction and looking at how students are doing versus trying to make something. Great.
Tara, I like your comment about the teachers need to understand the content. We've been having conversations about that at our school when teachers move grade levels or they're new to grade level or as a brand new teacher, they themselves need to know the content in which they're teaching, because if they don't have clarity on that, they can't provide it for their students. So that is nice about this resource, but I think even with this resource, something to keep in mind is it's not just about the resource, it's the process and the planning and the thinking through. And the teachers themselves need to solve the problems. They need to take the assessments prior so that they really develop a firm understanding of what they're teaching. So I appreciate that point that you made, because that has been in a lot of our conversations recently here at school.
Great, thanks so much. Yes, and that really ties to that last session where we talked about our teachers were doing that and unpacking that. And then this is tied to that. You have to understand that first before you dive in.
And I
Great.
think one of the things in OPS, and I know in my previous district where we have the lessons already designed and that you're studying them, I think sometimes there's a surface level of understanding because it's done for us. And so that's a great thing. But I agree, really digging deep into it, unpacking it, making sure you understand it, working it out is super, super critical.
Tara, same thing here. We have a lot of resources from our district office, which are absolutely fabulous and great. But then we take that and just teach from it instead of using it as a starting point in our planning.
Mhm.
And so that's where we're going to try to use some planning time this summer with our staff and really do the unpacking in both math and reading. But getting away from just saying, well, here's my lesson plan that was provided for me, I'm just going to teach from it. I think that's where a lot of learning time gets lost.
Great. Thank you all for sharing that. Yes, that is, it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? If you don't have enough resources, you spend the time trying to make something. If you do have them, sometimes you don't fully, have that process to digest them. Yep. And these resources, the one thing I also want to name is that, they do have, you probably noticed at the beginning, it is nice. They have the objective for the session. They tell you what you need. So you do have to, as a teacher, process that. They have it labeled guided practice, independent practice, and additional practice. And we'll look in a minute. We're going to dive into when the teacher was planning with her co-teacher to use these. So you'll get to see the process they took there. So hopefully that aligns with some of what you all were thinking. Okay, yes. So the next thing we're going to look at now is on the next page in the note catcher. That it's actually in there. It's not a specific link. You'll get to see what did the teachers do from here. So they did the diagnostics, so just in time. They know there's this resource that can address what they need to with students. Now, what do they do? How do they make a plan to actually deliver it to students? So let's take 4 minutes to read that in your note catcher. And then we'll come back and we may or may not break into breakout rooms. We're kind of a small group, but we'll see about that. So take 4 minutes and just, again, what do you notice about how the teachers plan for acceleration? It's Ms. Hutchins and a co-teacher. And then how does the plan address the learning needs identified from the screener, the diagnostic that we looked at last time? So 4 minutes. All right, one more minute. And then when we come back, let's plan to do a whip around where we each share one thing we noticed. Okay, let's come back together. And just each of us, let's just name one thing you noticed about how Ms. Hutchins and her team planned for acceleration. Just go ahead and unmute when you're ready for your
They talked about using flexible grouping quite a bit so that they would have some fluidity with those students from group to group.
Great, flexible grouping.
One thing that we noted was how far in advance she is pre-teaching these skills 2 weeks, and then also her time block. It said that she built in a 45-minute acceleration block. And so Brenda and I were just talking about, like, what would that look like realistically at our building, kind of, because that's just staying really on top of what's coming next in planning and preparation.
So there was a lot of, there's the 2-week look ahead, then also the blocks like planning. Great. Other things you noticed?
Maggie, that was the same thing that Janine and I were just talking about, is how do we stay ahead of it? We always start with best intentions, and then it seems like things like sneak up on us, or sometimes even get away from us. Like I started this meeting saying, you know, we haven't even had a chance yet to use the things that we used last time. And then you feel like, I'm losing control of this because this all looks so great. So it's being prepared and staying ahead of that, and then not letting things come up in your way, because that's how you tackle that stuff. So
there was some sort of structure in place to have this happen. Yep, great.
Jennifer, we feel the same way. How do we stay on top?
I know.
And get teams planning far enough in advance that we can execute a plan like this. But we feel the exact same way.
And honestly, it's, you know, you kind of talk out of both sides of your mouth, and we want teachers to do both things. We want them to plan far enough in advance that they know what's coming and that they could be this prepared. And at the same time, we want them to change their lessons from day to day based on what they see, you know, and reacting to what they see formatively in the classrooms. And I think that when teachers are really skillful, they can do that. It's just how do you teach them to do that if they aren't there yet? And that's why I'm thankful for this time together, because it helps us think about how we do that, because that's our job, right? That's why we come to work every day. So yeah, I'm just thankful for this thinking, because we'll get there, and we've taken steps every year to get there. It's just, how do we do that work better?
I think one of the things that Megan and I talk about, and with our leadership team, is that it's really a marathon, and that, you know, where I want to be right now, people aren't ready to be there. And so I have to take them where they are and really honor where they are, which I thought was really great for the way she created her groups, Ms. Hutchinson and her teammate, where they really specifically focused on what students needed. So when they were planning for the students, they looked at real world connections. So it's, you know, when you're trying to take people on this journey, it's about identifying where they are and helping them. So where and what they can do for the students. And so I thought that that was something that was very powerful, was that each one of those groups were very specific for for that group, and that it wasn't a one size fits all. And as we're trying to do this work, we tend to think, okay, we've got so much to do. We've got these grandiose ideas. We've got to get it done because kids only have 1 year in each grade level. But it's really focusing and honoring where kids and where teachers are, and knowing that when we know better, we do better, and honoring that process.
Absolutely.
I agree.
You really hit that on the head here, that under the content side, it was really tied, see that last bullet, it was really tied to specific content needs. She knew what they needed and then tied there. Used a high quality curriculum aligned resource. We want to be doing that. There was instructional time for small groups so that they could work together. It's just in time or 2 weeks ahead, that planning and looking ahead. And then, the kids were grouped together based on their learning needs and their strengths. You guys really hit on those.
But there was something else I felt like was powerful, because at the end she delegated and got volunteers. And that's, I think, one of those things where we want to do it all ourselves and we forget there are people around who want to help. And so it's us being that 2 weeks ahead so that we can prepare those materials, but make changes and adaptations as we need to, but making sure we're delegating and getting those people to help who are ready and willing.
And you all are noticing that, and it's coming soon. I know that it's really hard to focus on the process when the structures aren't yet there for you. I do promise those are coming soon. And that is an example of that. Like, just get us thinking about, like, what could this volunteer, could it be a Google sheet or what is it? Like, those structures are coming. So, like, let's try to put those in a small bucket for later for ourselves. We want to be bubbling up those ideas, but not get bogged down yet on those. Let's see the process. And then we will get to what structures might we want to put in place to get them there. Great. And before we move on, I want to make sure I heard from all the school teams except James and Ryan, thoughts on Miss Hutchins, how she planned for acceleration. Anything else you guys would like to share that wasn't named?
I would just add, and it was mentioned, but just the system piece of adding in that additional time for learning, being on the front end of it, but making that a part of the systemic change rather than leaving it up to individual teachers to figure that out on their own. I think that's the huge first step. And then that kind of leads into, some of Jennifer's comments just about finding the time, and, it can't be all on the principal to lead teachers how to figure it out without systemic changes, and it can't be put on just the teachers to figure out how to manage that time within their own situation. So I think the big takeaway for me is just that systemic commitment to addressing some of these issues, and then changes can be adapted from there.
So it sounds like everyone on the call has some ideas for, we want to do this. What structures in the future might we need to put in place to make sure that it can happen? Okay, great. All right. Well, let's talk now. Let's shift gears a little bit from the small group, which I admit is sometimes, if the structures aren't yet in place, a little trickier to implement. Let's talk about what we would want to do, or what a teacher might do if the whole class needs some support. So last time, you might remember that most of the students did not do very well on number one, which was the size of the whole has to be the same in order for us to compare two fractions. Okay, you kind of noticed some of that in the materials. You guys pulled that out, but the whole class you probably noticed needed a little bit more of that. So let's look at some examples. And I will admit, this is my favorite part of the session because I love these. I feel like they're low-hanging fruit. I feel like if I was a new teacher, I would see these and say, okay, yep, that's something I can implement. So I'll just be full disclosure. I love this part. So go ahead and look at these whole class acceleration supports and take 5 minutes to look at these examples. All topics won't need a whole class support, right? But some might. And so this is an example of what you could do if the whole class needs a little bit of a boost. So take 5 minutes to look at those in your note catcher, and then we'll come back and talk about what we noticed. Okay, we'll come back in 30 seconds. All right, let's come back. So these examples, we're not saying that it's an exhaustive list of things you can do in whole group. These are just examples of what a teacher might consider. So let's talk about what are some commonalities you noticed across those 4 different options that the teacher might take. Maybe the teacher does one, maybe the teacher does a few of them. What are some commonalities that you noticed across the examples?
I think they all provide like some kind of a visual support, and then obviously that comparison of the quantities.
Mhm. I know it, it sort of feels like a broken record at this point, right? But yes, the visuals are so important. Yes, so they're comparing the quantities and they're using the visuals. Mhm. I think that, I noticed a lot of integrating it into the current work. So yeah, there are the warm-ups, which is building toward that current work, but the other 3 were really, or the next 2 were using an actual problem from that grades lesson, just emphasizing this idea that they knew students needed a little bit of extra support with. So you don't have to have this brand new lesson for the day. It's just noticing, what do I want to pull out from this activity? Right. And I thought that was neat between example 2 and example 3, that they had that in common. They used the grade level material. But then the teacher, back to what you guys were saying about kind of staying ahead, the teacher knew what they were looking for. And so they were able to, in the moment, say, okay, let me find one student who drew a smaller bar, one a larger bar, hold them up, and then have that conversation. Other things you noticed?
Well, I think even with the commonalities is kids showing the common way that they drew things, which I think is what's kind of been said, but how important it is to have that conversation, because looking at the first one, I'd rather have the 4th piece of pizza than the half because of the way it's drawn, and making sure that you're having those conversations and that we're hearing more of the students' voices, which demonstrates their level of understanding of the concept, which
Mhm.
then guides your misconceptions, which then helps facilitate and guide your questioning to help students grow and understand.
You really hit that there, Tara. It's having that conversation with students. So we notice in here there's lots of those questions. Which one would you rather have? Why? What do you notice? So getting kids to talk about the math in that way. So that is a commonality here. Any other things you noticed or questions you have about these? Okay. Well, I think it's, we've noticed that the success is the result of that intentional planning. So knowing where you're going, what kind of questions you want to ask, what do you want students to think about? And we need to plan the who, the what, and the when of the acceleration supports. Okay. So what does that actually look like in action? What does it look like to deliver this to students? Because we are just a little bit tight on time, what I'm going to have us do is actually read both of the case studies at once and then talk about them together, because I think that'd be better than going back and forth. So there's 2 case studies in your note catcher. From page 12 and 13 is a description of what Miss Hutchins does, and page 14 is a description of what another teacher does. And so why don't you read both of those, so 12 through 14, and then we can come back together and talk about what we noticed in Miss Hutchins, which is case study part 1, and the other teacher part 2. So we can compare them a little bit. So let's take, I think maybe 5 minutes will probably be fine. We could take 6 if we need to, but let's start with 5 to read pages 12 through 14. to look at how those teachers actually delivered this instruction. All right, we'll come back together in 1 minute. Okay, let's come back together and let's focus on case study part 1 first. That was Miss Hutchins. And let's also think back to the answers that we all shared earlier about what time we were coached, and maybe try to imagine like how's this related to Miss Hutchins' delivery of the acceleration lessons. So what stood out to you about that, either related or not to the coaching idea?
I thought it was important that Ms. Hutchins began the lesson with the growth mindset. She takes a look at the students in the I can statements, focusing on what their goals are for the lesson, where instead of focusing on what they're going to grow and do, Ms. Field starts with the session objective. And so, taking a look at what we want to accomplish, what our goals are, what I can do, what I want to learn. Those are all important questions to ask students, as we get ready to start a lesson.
Mhm. Great. So starting that positive growth mindset. Thanks, James. What else about how Ms. Hutchins delivered these acceleration small lessons in small group?
I think one of the main things she did was she created a safe environment because the student was able, Kamal was able to say he's not sure. And so in order to create that safe environment that then in turn allows students to be vulnerable and show their examples and compare them to someone else, and to make sure they're having that conversation along with the compliments that they were giving to one another. I feel like because math is very difficult for so many students and adults. And so I think creating that safe environment really helps, I think goes along with what James was saying about the growth mindset and students being willing to be vulnerable.
Great. So setting up that safe environment, then teeter up to use the student work, right? Which is, something we kind of mentioned in the coaching earlier. It's like show, not tell, right? So it's like if you can have the students look at their own work, I mean, that's going to go really far. And if we have that community and that safe space set up, students can do that. Great. Other things you noticed? There are lots of things in there.
Um, it's just interesting how she knew where she wanted them to go, but didn't really tell them, just kind of led them there through questioning and observing what they were doing. So she was really purposeful in the things that she asked them to do, and then used that to guide where she went next. So like when their pictures didn't match, then she put them side by side and asked them what they noticed, and let kids kind of naturally come to those conclusions, which then solidifies their understandings or allows them to say, wait, I don't understand why that didn't do that. And then they kind of connected to what they had done before. Rather than in the other one where she just told them what to do and kind of step by step procedurally, but kids don't understand the reasoning behind it.
So yeah, I want to draw out what you said. She posed those purposeful questions because she wanted to advance the student thinking. And she was able to ask those questions because she knew where she was going, right? So this all ties together. Yeah, and I want to note that Miss Fields, the other teacher, I think I assume all teachers have the best intentions, right? Like we're doing the best we can. And so, but when you see these side to side, you think, oh, wow, like that is a pretty big difference in the way the delivery comes. And like, what small tweaks can we do to make it so that students have that experience? Because let's think about what would be different about the student experience if you're coming in with that growth mindset and the productive community. You see your work being used as examples, you talk about your work, and your teacher's asking you questions to guide you there. Like, how might that impact students' experience in these small group sessions? I guess it feels rhetorical, but it's like you're probably more willing to go to them, right? Like you might be more excited about these small group sessions. You have a great relationship with your teacher. You feel capable because the teacher's asking you these questions, and then you feel like you're making some connections. So, that's the idea here, is that by delivering it in this way, we can make it so that students feel good about doing this work. Did anyone notice towards the end what was happening with Miss Hutchins? What were some things she did after the guided practice and asking the questions. I can just name it. Students had time to do independent practice. So kind of like what we were talking about with coaching, you need some practice, right? You're doing it, your coach might model, but then you do need some at bats, right? And so she gave them time to do independent practice. But then at the very end, Ms. Hutchins was reflecting, right? She was reflecting, and she actually asked the students to reflect. So getting them to kind of tie a bow on their work for the day and feel like they had some agency in that learning. So that they're seeing, okay, I made this connection today. And she was able to jot down her notes. Okay, for next session, here are some things I want to highlight. Just as a coach might write down some things after practice of, okay, let's start with these next time, or let's keep this in mind next time. So she was really approaching it from that, in that way, she's growth mindset too. Anything else folks want to call out about Ms. Hutchins, things that stood out, something that, resonated with you? I guess, now would be a time I'd love to hear, what are some things that teachers at your school do in either acceleration or, when they're doing some small group review? What are some practices you see them do that have been successful? It's hard being so far away. I don't know what it's like in your schools. There's some things the teachers in your school do.
I think we have two sections of fourth grade, and this case study could really probably come right from our school. We have one teacher that is really experienced, and she teaches like Miss Hutchins, like she's just masterful, and she makes it look easy, and her kids love coming to school, and they talk about their learning and are they just, I don't know, like even just reading this, it was fun to read, and you wanted to see what she was going to ask them to do next and how they were going to do it. And then we have another teacher that's a new teacher, and she's grown a lot this year, and she's learning and she wants to know more. But she teaches really traditionally right now, and is much like Miss Field, and her kids, they complain sometimes about what they're doing, and those connections don't come as naturally. And she wants to know, how do I get my kids to do what they're doing next door? And so she's learning, and that is her mentor. But you see the difference in the way that kids, number one, want to be present at school, and number two, learn at an accelerated level. And so much of it has to do with teacher practice. And it's about that thoughtful planning and knowing your kids really well and what they need, understanding where it is that you're going. I think we make so many connections, and then it's how do we thoughtfully fill those holes for teachers so that they can be prepared to step in front of kids to do that. I kind of answered your questions about what we see, but I think we definitely see the difference in teachers that have it and teachers that are still working on it.
And so that makes me think of, how do we name those practices that these teachers do? Because these vignettes are interesting, and it could be a good example for you to sort of do with teachers, but how do we get those in front of teachers? So one thing I was going to name here, on that idea of this effective instruction, are you all familiar with Principles to Actions, the NCTM book? Okay, so you are. So the 8, effective mathematics teaching practices, that could be a way to start. Maybe they're working on number 3 for this year, using connect mathematical representations, right? Maybe it's facilitating that discourse. But I think one place that might be helpful there, others please chime in, is just naming these practices for teachers that may just not even be aware that this is an option,
Erin, we've been talking about that just a little bit. Like you said, when we get together, the idea is the same, but there's a difference in the delivery. So how do we transform our planning where we're focusing specifically on the delivery of information? We're talking about what kind of questions that we're going to ask, how you're going to ask them and elicit responses from your students, those kinds of things. And again, I think it's just using the resources that we have as a starting point, not an end point. And our job as coaches here at Clinton, we're fortunate we have there's 4 of us. But thinking about like, how do we facilitate those planning conversations with teams and to even build capacity in our team leaders to start doing it on their own, that we've got, you know, once we have the plan, we have to focus on the delivery of it, because like Jennifer was explaining, you could have 2 teachers, you know, and one just because of experience, you know, could really add a lot to the delivery. And it's not that the other one can't do it, just hasn't, you know, had the time to develop in that area yet. So that's just what this has me thinking about as we move forward at our building. We facilitate the planning to focus on delivery and being really intentional about the delivery, so we can, you know, just have more successful experiences. Like,
Yeah,
One
that
thing
makes sense.
that we
Thank you for
talked
sharing.
one thing that we talked about and we've tried to do to kind of even that playing field is like do some videotaping of lessons, almost kind of like instructional rounds. So like we see something that is the way we want it to look, like Miss Hutchins, and then videotape that lesson, then several grade levels watch that and pick up those instructional practices, almost like reading this vignette, but we're watching it and then looking at those practices in action. So we've learned about it, we've talked about it, we've planned about it. Now let's watch it in action. So we're kind of leveling the playing field, because sometimes what we found is if teachers can see it, they'll do it. Everybody wants to be great. So if you can see it, then hopefully you know what it looks like, so you can replicate it and maybe have to put your own personality into it. But that's one thing that our teachers, the feedback that we've gotten is that they love that. And with COVID, we haven't been able to go into each other's classrooms, but to videotape it and then have them be able to see that whole thing, they actually have liked that even better.
Great, thanks for sharing that. So like having them see it in action and naming those practices. Great.
we have something similar, Jennifer, that we did this year, just again, because of COVID and we can't get teachers, well, before we couldn't get teachers in classrooms. I mean, just logistics of that, but we have been working with Anita Archer for the last couple of years, and she gives us specific action items to work on. And so when we see those being done really well, we video them, and then we have just like a running document. We call them actions in action, and teachers can access it. And
oh, great.
Yeah, so that's been helpful. But how do we, then it's how do we take that and put it in, into action?
Right.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
like, there's lots of teachers that will watch something once and do it, and it's not that they don't want to, but
it's about that practice. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I want to keep us moving. It's so hard to stop these great conversations, but I appreciate everybody sharing. And I think we found this nice community where we're kind of all working through this together. So thanks for sharing. I know you nodded your head, Maggie, but if anybody else, wants to check out Principles to Action, definitely a great resource. And the whole point of this session, you all really hit on each of these, that we want to get students involved in making meaning of the math. We're getting them to work on it. We want to get them talking, so they're engaged in that discourse. And you also this multiple times posing those purposeful questions. So how do they do that to assess and advance student thinking? So we want to get more of the teachers working in this way with students, especially when we're trying to accelerate students. So I think we're all on board with that. Now we're just thinking, how do we get more of it to happen? So great. I know we're sort of butting up on time, so let me just give you 1 minute to think about this portion. The delivery is not the end, as you're kind of saying, like there's all these pieces. Ms. Hutchins and any teacher that's delivering this acceleration wants to monitor, we got to monitor students and how they're doing, right? Because we could think we're doing a great job, but if students are not making progress, we need to adjust our practice. So again, because we're butting up on time, just take 1 minute to click into this document. It's linked through your note catcher, the monitoring tool. Again, this is a template. We wouldn't expect anyone to have to fill out this whole template, but the idea is just look at how the teacher and what the teacher is monitoring, because, teach, monitor, feedback, teach, monitor, feedback. We want to have some way to see how students are doing. So we'll come back in 1 minute.
You can kind of see. Not yet. Not yet. Not yet.
All right, so hopefully that quick minute was enough for you to just kind of get a snapshot of the types of things Ms. Hutchins was looking for during the session. And maybe she just had this on a clipboard, right? She had the date at the top, she knew what she was working on that date, and she had the students' names and could take some notes. What were some things you noticed that she was capturing, and then how could that help her with future instructional decisions?
Hi, I'm just gonna go ahead and
Thank
speak.
you.
We were kind of talking here. Basically, like those next steps are her lesson plans, as small chunks of it, knowing what her next steps are gonna be, and if she needs to go back and reteach, or if she's just continuing the session. So they are planning for her next steps in her lesson plans itself. I also just kind of like the fact too, with her anecdotal notes about there next to it. And just, again, she can move into making those flexible groups. I know Megan kind of talked about that earlier, about the fluid of the groupings. And yeah, I mean, that just follows right what she said earlier today. So I love it. I like it.
Great. So she's using the things she noticed to then make her next steps. That's a great noticing, and those anecdotal notes are going to help her do that. And then obviously tracking, do they seem to understand it? Not yet. And then that helps also with that next steps. Great. All right. So, why is this important? We know from lots and lots of research that the process of continuously monitoring students' learning process, helps us as educators to clarify the goals, be responsive, and involve students in that process. So, we can make the plan, we can deliver the plan, but we can't forget to monitor how students are doing and see if it's working. So, things to think about, what could you be using to monitor? Maybe you have some student work, maybe you took notes, maybe it's the formative assessments like we talked about last time, exit tickets. And then, you mentioned this, that, use that evidence to inform your decisions about the groupings and then what content. So you all have this, what needs to happen. So how do we get there? So checking student work and monitoring that is how we know if our teaching is resulting in learning, right? Okay, I can't believe our time is up already, but here we are wrapping up. So if you have space in your schedule, I know that we're coming off spring break and you might have had some plans for session 2, but if you have space in your schedule, if you're a school-based leader, think about working with one teacher to support in planning these just-in-time acceleration, either small or whole group based on data. So if you would start small, maybe you have bigger plans than that, but just try that. And if you're a district-based leader, observe maybe a co-planning session, or observe, a teacher's acceleration instruction before our next session. We'll get to hear how it's going. In our next session, we're going to talk more about the small group and individual supports and how we can plan those. Okay. Before you go, we would really appreciate if you could fill out the. Do I not have it here? I'm sorry. Fill out the survey, because that is very